When disaster strikes in the U.S., FEMA's mission is to be there to help. They have over 20,000 employees and spend tens of billions of tax dollars a year.
I have not talked to any FEMA people.
In the wake of Hurricane Helene, from Florida through the Carolinas, the rescues and repairs were largely left to local armies of volunteers and neighbors.
When there's a big disaster like this, do we need a FEMA or a big FEMA?
The new Trump administration promises a major shakeup to make America healthy again.
We are the sickest country in the world.
RFK Jr. is leading a movement that's being joined by many voices and experts once shunned by the establishment.
What governments can do to help the population is to improve the food environment.
This week, two key voices in a healthy revolution.
Let's go to one more telephone call for the moment.
Millions of Americans get their news and information listening to AM radio.
What do you think about that?
But there's a move to remove it from the airwaves.
There are a great many millions of people out in the middle of the country that are going to be grateful that Congress acted to save AM radio.
This week, a look and a listen at why AM radio still matters.
Welcome to Full Measure. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. One of the federal agencies that could face serious reform under the new Trump administration is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. We're giving about $33 billion of our tax dollars to FEMA this year. It's often plagued by controversy, and there have been multiple efforts to reform FEMA. But when Hurricane Helene struck last fall, the aftermath exposed an agency where a surprising political bias permeates, and the mission of equity officially outranks disaster relief.
Michael Smith runs a small business in Georgia with 5 employees.
Done 40 houses since the storm, just putting tarps on, nothing else.
He worked nonstop after Helene hit.
Well, they said at one time in Coffee County, where I'm from, that there was 19 tornadoes down on the dirt at one time.
So we remained in our home, but we got teenagers in our home. They were scared to death.
You've probably seen a lot of the devastation in North Carolina, but Helene also roared through Florida, Tennessee, South Carolina, Virginia, and right here in Georgia.
You'd open the doors with that wind blowing that hard, and it was really scary, so I'd shut the door back.
Do you think it was a tornado or the hurricane winds?
Don't know. And all this stuff you see is stuff we're moving out of the attic now.
And
Michael Angelo James is mayor of Waycross, Georgia. We spoke with him on our visit 3 weeks after Helene hit.
you have seen FEMA. They have offered some help and done some work. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, one of the things they've done is provided numbers for us to call, just in case there's disaster assistance needed. That's one. And then on the other side of that, they've allowed for us to have interactions with them so that we will know boots on the ground kind of things that will be taking place.
The aftermath of Helene has stoked long-standing controversies about the role of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
With building, right.
Jim Blackburn is battalion chief with the Waycross, Georgia Fire Department.
The Georgia Emergency Management Agency has been here since before the hurricane even hit, and I haven't personally seen any FEMA people, but I'm assuming FEMA's here and helping people.
Okay, but you're the battalion chief, and you haven't personally talked to any FEMA people?
I have not talked to any FEMA people.
At the center of the debate is FEMA's effectiveness and relevance, and a question of whether the locals should lead disaster relief efforts instead of the federal government. After Helene struck, images flooded the news and internet showing non-government volunteers airlifting supplies, climbing treacherous terrain in Tennessee, delivering aid in North Carolina by mule and goats, and stepping up to deliver food, water, and baby items.
Made some new friends. What's y'all's name? John, Luke, Larry, Tim.
FEMA found itself fighting rumors that it was seldom seen and offering people who'd lost everything $750.
But there are other forms that you may qualify for after you apply for disaster assistance. You can receive things like temporary housing or home repair costs.
FEMA was created 46 years ago under President Jimmy Carter to centralize the nation's disaster relief efforts. 4 years after FEMA's inception, the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, reported the agency didn't have enough staff and had difficulties defining its mission, goals, and objectives. In 1992, after Hurricane Andrew, the GAO said FEMA's strategy for dealing with catastrophic disasters was inadequate. After Hurricanes Katrina in 2005 and Sandy in 2012, the GAO criticized FEMA's response, and Congress passed laws to reform FEMA. And more recently, added responsibilities sheltering illegal immigrants and with COVID relief have left FEMA critically short-staffed with burned-out employees, according to GAO. In 2020, FEMA's disaster workforce lost 20% of its staff. GAO reported that FEMA faced challenges deploying staff with the right qualifications and skills at the right time. In 2022, GAO says FEMA was stretched, handling 444,000 applications for COVID funeral assistance and using processes that open the door to fraud. Amid the criticism, FEMA listed some surprising priorities in its 2025 budget request for more than $33 billion. It lists equity and climate resilience as top goals, ahead of the core mission of coordinating and delivering federal assistance. Mike Smith is a longtime meteorologist and weather reporter who has studied FEMA.
Well, there are a number of whistleblowers from FEMA who have said that DEI is overwhelming the culture at FEMA to the extent that it's really causing issues with helping the people who have been suffering from disasters.
But if someone is in another...
In November, more scandal when a FEMA manager got caught instructing Helene relief workers to avoid helping Trump supporters. She got fired after the publicity, but later indicated political discrimination is standard at the agency for worker safety.
So you feared the Trump houses. The people on FEMA were fearing the Trump houses like they were fearing people with vicious dogs in their backyard.
Exactly. And that's based on the trends.
At a recent hearing, the head of FEMA, Deanne Criswell, addressed the controversy.
So immediately upon the termination of the employee that made this direction, I sent out an email to the workforce, letting them know what is expected of them and that we serve all people. I have been in this job for 3.5 years, and my focus has always been on putting people first, and that's all people.
If I were President Trump and had to make that decision, I would probably downscale FEMA a great deal. So I think of FEMA as a coordinating agency after a major disaster such as a tsunami or a major tornado or a hurricane or a giant wildfire like the one in Maui makes some sense, but the FEMA on the ground model that they have now doesn't seem to be working.
As for the question of FEMA's ultimate role, the locals in Waycross, Georgia still see a place for the federal government.
Do you think in the end this is a local community responsibility and effort that it comes down to, or do you think there is a very important role the feds have to play?
I think the initial response is there's responsibility of the local governments, and I think we did that to the best of our ability. But after the fact, the local governments can't rebuild homes, and they don't have the money, local resources to do that. So I think that's where the federal government has to step in.
When there's a big disaster like this, do we need a FEMA or a big FEMA? What are your thoughts?
My original thought was we probably will be able to handle it because of how we've done things in times past. But then we saw where there would possibly be a need because it is so widespread. If it had not been in the capacity that it has been this time, the scope of this is much larger than our city could do and our county could do.
FEMA has given out $47 million in what's called displacement assistance for Helene and recently extended the deadline to apply for relief to January 7th. When we come back, some lead figures in the movement to make America healthy again. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. faces ardent support as well as harsh opposition in the Senate, where hearings will be held to confirm him as Donald Trump's head of Health and Human Services. HHS is in charge of our health agencies, the FDA, NIH, and the CDC. I interviewed Kennedy when he was campaigning for president. He spoke about exactly what he wants to do to make America healthy again.
You've spoken more than any candidate that I've heard about a really big problem, chronic health disorders that are plaguing our society, our children and adults as well, such as immune disorders like juvenile diabetes, Crohn's, POTS, celiac disease, as well as disorders like autism, the epidemic that has not been successfully addressed even by the most well-funded public health agencies in the world. What would you do about that?
Well, we've gone from having 6% of Americans have chronic disease when my uncle was president to probably around 60% now. We don't really know because NIH won't publish the numbers or do the studies. And we have the sickest generation of kids that we've ever had in our country, and we are the sickest country in the world. Oh, you have to figure out an exposure that hit all Americans, every demographic beginning around 1989. There's a limited number of them. High fructose corn syrup, cell phone radiation, and there are PFOAs, which are flame retardants that were put in a lot of products, our children's pajamas, and almost every piece of furniture at that time. And then the vaccine schedule that, of course, went from 3 vaccines I had as a kid to 72 vaccines over a very short period of time during that period. And all of those diseases, by the way, are listed on the manufacturer's inserts for those 72 vaccines as potential side effects. So those have to be a culprit too. It's probably a combination of all of these, insults. I'm going to go down to Bethesda, to NIH headquarters, and I'm going to say to them, we're going to shift a lot of our focus now from development of incubating pharmaceutical drugs, pharmaceutical products, which is what NIH does, allow them to treat the chronic disease that they're causing. And I'm going to say, we're going to start figuring out what's causing the chronic disease. And there's a lot of other things that need to be done. We need to get pharmaceutical advertising off of TV so that the television stations can return to telling the truth to the American public about health rather than serving as propagandists for this very, very corrupt industry.
Another key public health figure who's been voicing the need to reform establishment medicine is Dr. Aseem Malhotra. He's a British cardiologist who stood out prior to COVID by flagging the serious health risks from processed food. During COVID, he started out as a vaccine advocate. That was until his father, also a doctor, died from heart problems he says were caused by the COVID vaccine. Today, he talks with me about his new film, First Do No Farm.
Patient began to verbalize feelings of killing other people, and then himself.
They are now out of control as an entity that is purely there to make money. First Do No Farm is a documentary film which really helps the public, policymakers and doctors understand how we've got to this situation of such a worsening pandemic of chronic disease because of manipulation of information that doctors receive from very powerful big corporations.
He went to his doctor and after a short visit was given Zoloft, which is an antidepressant for insomnia, and 5 weeks later took his own life.
Lifestyle changes should be our first port of call, both for our physical as well as our mental health.
It highlights how medical knowledge has come under commercial control, but most doctors don't know that. And invariably, the results of clinical trials exaggerate the safety and benefits of drugs, which means that patients are not really truly getting informed consent when it comes to taking pills. And that's on the back of the fact they also hide data on harms, and that causes a huge issue of side effects and deaths. And one of the commentators in First Do No Farm actually very reasonably concludes that it's likely that millions of people have been killed because of corruption and medical fraud.
Can you be specific and say if you had the power to do 1, 2, 3 really important things that you want to do first? Have you thought about what those things would be?
The first thing is, because we know that Big Pharma have, in essence, been getting away with, harming millions of people for so many years, I think they can develop drugs, but they can no longer test them. They need to be independently analyzed. The studies need to be designed by independent experts, and the analysis on whether the drugs are beneficial needs to be done by independent experts. I think the second thing that I would suggest is that regulatory agencies like the FDA should not take any money from pharma. I think it's an absolute scandal that 65% of the funding of the FDA comes from Big Pharma. I think the third thing I would do is that I would treat ultra-processed food like tobacco. Ultra-processed food is a new tobacco, and therefore what governments can do to help the population is to improve the food environment.
I'll bet you the thought of putting a warning label on the product might quickly prompt some of the food manufacturers to be creative and figure out other ways to make the food taste good besides the ways that they're currently doing that.
Absolutely, Sharyl. We know we need the food industry, but what's happened is greed has replaced need, and it may be that their profits get reduced, but they've been making money essentially from deceiving people, and that's not acceptable. So, we want them to create healthier foods. Ultimately, people are going to eat less as a result, but we'll have a healthier population. And at least I hope the CEOs of these food companies, with their conscience will be clear, if nothing else.
You can watch the film First Do No Farm at nofarmfilm.com. They took no commercial money to stay independent and are charging $10 to download. Coming up on Full Measure, the static over AM radio being tuned out. From War of the Worlds to President Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats, amplitude-modulated radio, AM radio, has been an important part of America's storied history. But is AM getting tuned out? Lisa Fletcher takes a look.
Let's go to one more telephone call. Professor Mike, you're on the Chris Plant Show.
I just wanted to call about Kamala. I'm a sort of an expert on personality disorders.
Chris Plant is a syndicated conservative talk radio host based in Washington, D.C.
What does it boil down to?
The symptom of perseveration, when you keep repeating the same phrase, it shows a lack of judgment.
Yeah, I think that's 100% true.
His roots in radio go back nearly as far as the technology itself.
My grandfather came home from World War I and started in radio in 1922. My family, myself, my brother, my stepfather, my mother, my grandfather have all been in radio.
Plant is heard daily on hundreds of radio stations across America.
Bum, bum.
Talk radio is the most popular format on AM radio, with roughly 1 in 5 adults in the U.S. listening every month. That's almost 47 million Americans.
We still got to get to the Democrat billionaire sponsor, Mark Cuban. He went on The View, and he said stupid stuff.
Donald Trump, you never see him around strong, intelligent women, ever.
Yeah, right. Have you met his wife? Because his wife is a pretty amazing woman.
Yet, despite its popularity, AM radio is disappearing. Not from the airwaves, but from some electric vehicles, including Tesla, BMW, and Volvo. Manufacturers say it is no longer installed because electric engines cause a reception problem and distort the sound. AM radios were first introduced in cars in the 1930s and have been a standard feature ever since. Today, more than 4,000 stations broadcast on the AM band, offering a diverse range of formats, from bluegrass in Virginia to farm-related programming in Nebraska.
Check our cash livestock prices on the Rural Radio Network.
Qualities that Plant believes make it unique and deeply connected to local communities.
For people who aren't listening to AM radio in their car or listening to it on an actual radio at home,
Right.
what are people missing? What's on AM radio these days?
Spanish language and African American news channels and sports stations and Christian stations all have a following, and you can only find them on AM radio. The most interactive form of media for years and years has been talk radio, because listeners can call in and get on the air with the host and express their opinions. You can't call in to ABC News and get on the air with David Muir, but you can call in to a national radio show and get on the air and have your voice heard.
Hey, Chris.
Hey, Bill.
My wife and I were at the Tucker Carlson show last night. RFK spoke beforehand, too, and I never clapped so hard for a Democrat in my life.
Wow. Yeah, RFK Jr. makes sense on a bunch of different topics.
While there is no question the technology challenges exist, some believe that the move to eliminate AM radio from vehicles is an attempt to restrict the reach of influential conservative radio shows.
And to the extent that there's a technical challenge, we've figured out more difficult problems than this in the past. And I think there are people who have it in for conservative talk radio for political reasons. For political reasons, that would like to see AM radio go away.
It's an issue that has caught the attention of Congress, with lawmakers from both parties introducing bipartisan bills that would require all new passenger vehicles to come with devices that can access AM stations as standard equipment.
I'm not big on mandating things and having government mandates on anything, but if it takes an act of Congress to keep AM radio, there are a great many millions of people out in the middle of the country and, honestly, in big cities too, that are going to be grateful. Hey, this weekend, we got this daylight saving time adjustment. We gain an hour, right? Kinda. But then it gets dark an hour earlier, which is another thing altogether. I blame Democrats for that, too.
For Plant, like his listeners, AM radio is personal, connecting, and a vibrant part of the American dialogue.
There are American traditions and norms that have been built up over the course of a century, and AM radio is very much a part of that.
For Full Measure, I'm Lisa Fletcher in Washington, D.C.
After a break, what's ahead next week on Full Measure? Coming up next week on Full Measure, a whistleblower reveals the unthinkable buried in our record-breaking illegal immigration crisis. The implication of what you're reporting is that the federal government is using taxpayer money to facilitate the end of the trip for the human traffickers.
Yeah, I mean, it's nothing less than taxpayer-funded child slavery, nothing less.
The border crisis and child trafficking in America next week on Full Measure. Until next time, we'll be searching for more stories that hold powers accountable. Thanks for watching. I'm Sharyl Attkisson.